They called her a placeholder, a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. In the world of the Falcone crime family, a wife was supposed to be decoration, slender, silent, and grateful. Margot Hess was none of those things. She was 28 years old, 5'4", and wore a size 18 with the same indifference she brought to everything else in her life, which was to say, complete and total. She had a PhD in forensic accounting that she'd finished at 24, a studio apartment in Queens that smelled like coffee and old books, and exactly zero interest in the Falcone family or anything connected to it. Until the morning they came to collect her father's debt. Vincent Falcone didn't come himself, of course. Men like Vincent didn't collect. They sent 2 men in a black SUV, and those 2 men sat across from her father at the kitchen table while Margot stood in the doorway in her bathrobe, still holding her mug, watching her father's face go the color of old chalk. The debt was $400,000. Her father had borrowed from Vincent Falcone 2 years ago to keep his restaurant from closing, and then borrowed again, and then again, and now the interest had swallowed the principal whole. Her father couldn't pay. So Vincent Falcone had made an offer instead. His son needed a wife, not a real one, not in any sense that mattered to the circles Vincent moved in. His son Nico had made enemies in 3 cities, and those enemies had started moving against the Falcone operation in ways that required a united front. A married man was a settled man. A settled man was a trustworthy man. That was the calculus of the underworld, and it had not changed in 100 years. Margot listened to all of this from the doorway. Then she set down her mug, walked to the table, and said, "What are the terms?" Both men stared at her like she'd materialized out of the wallpaper. Her father said her name like a warning. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "The terms," she said again. "Duration of the arrangement, financial settlement for my father's debt, monthly allowance, exit conditions. What are they?" It wasn't a question. It was a checklist. She was married to Nico Falcone 11 days later in a ceremony that lasted 22 minutes at a courthouse in Manhattan with 4 witnesses and no flowers. Nico didn't look at her during the ceremony. She didn't look at him either. There was nothing to look at him. This was a contract. She had read the actual document, all 14 pages, and she had marked 3 clauses for renegotiation and gotten 2 of them changed. Her father's debt was cleared. She received a monthly sum deposited into an account Vincent Falcone had no access to, and at the end of 2 years she could walk. Simple, practical, done. What followed was not simple. The Falcone family compound sat on 12 acres in Westchester County, and it was the kind of beautiful that came from old money and never apologized for it. Stone walls, gardens that had been tended for decades, a kitchen big enough to have its own postal code. Margot arrived with 2 suitcases and her laptop bag. A housekeeper named Mrs. Ottavia showed her to a suite on the 2nd floor. Margot thanked her, unpacked her books first, and went to find the Wi-Fi password. She met the rest of the family at dinner that first night. Vincent Falcone sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His wife, Greta, sat to his right, elegant, watchful, the kind of woman who saw everything and said almost nothing. There were 2 cousins, a lieutenant named Saul, whose last name Margot never caught, and an aunt who went by Connie, and who looked at Margot's body the way someone looks at a car that's been sold for parts. "She's big," Connie said to no one in particular, while Margot was sitting right there. Nico, at the other end of the table, didn't react. He was cutting his steak with the focused patience of someone who had decided this dinner was beneath his attention. Margot took a drink of water. "I'm also in the room," she said pleasantly. Connie blinked. "Just in case the distance was confusing," Margot added, and reached for the breadbasket. Vincent Falcone made a sound that might have been a laugh. He covered it with a cough. Greta looked at her with the first real interest she'd shown all evening. Nico finally looked at her too, just for a second. Then he went back to his steak. The compound had a library. That was the only thing that made the first 2 weeks survivable. Margot spent her mornings working. She'd taken on freelance forensic accounting contracts that she ran through a shell company because she had not spent 6 years earning that degree to let it collect dust, and her afternoons in the library, and her evenings in a state of armed neutrality with the man she had married. Nico Falcone was 33 years old and looked like an oil painting that had been punched in the face. He was dark-haired, quiet in the way that had nothing to do with gentleness, and he ran the Falcone operation's financial infrastructure with a precision that she recognized immediately because she had the same quality herself. He didn't waste words. He didn't perform warmth. He didn't feel. He moved through the compound like a man who was always calculating 3 moves ahead. She respected that, even when she found it irritating. What she didn't respect was the way his people talked about her when they thought she couldn't hear. The comments about her weight were the mild ones. The ones that landed sharper were about her utility. The suggestions that she was a liability. A civilian, deadweight Nico had strapped to himself out of desperation. She heard the word civilian the way other people heard a slur. One evening in the 3rd week, she was in the hallway outside Nico's office when she heard Sal through the door. "She's going to be a problem," Sal was saying. "She doesn't know this world. She's soft. If someone comes for you through her, she folds. She's got no training, no instincts, nothing." She stood very still. "She has other qualities," Nico said. "With respect, Nico, if nobody cares about a civilian wife's qualities in a war room." "Then it's a good thing we're not in a war room," Nico said, and the conversation ended. Margot walked back to the library. She sat with her book for a long time without reading a word of it. The thing about being underestimated your entire life is that it teaches you things that nobody who has never been underestimated ever gets to learn. You learn to observe without being observed. You learn to listen past the words to the thing underneath. You learn that the people who dismiss you are, by definition, not watching you, and there is no more useful state of invisibility in the world. What nobody in the Falcone compound knew about Margot Hess was this: her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had gone sideways with grief for 3 years, and during those 3 years Margot had lived with her uncle in rural Montana. Her uncle was a former Army Ranger who had come home from 2 tours with nothing but a property, a gun safe, and a philosophy about self-reliance that bordered on religion. By the time her father pulled himself back together and Margot came home, she could field strip a rifle in the dark, shoot a 9mm with either hand, and had opinions about tactical positioning in a built environment that her uncle called better than most of the guys in my unit. She had never told anyone about this. It had never come up. People looked at her body, at her smile, at her books and her spreadsheets and her coffee shop life. And they built a story, and she had learned long ago that other people's stories about her were the most useful thing she owned. She let them keep the story. The problem started in the 5th week. The Calabrese family had been making moves against the Falcons for 2 years. Slow, methodical, surgical. They'd flipped 2 Port Authority contacts, disrupted 3 shipments, made overtures to 2 of Vincent's oldest lieutenants. It was the kind of patient pressure that only a family that was certain of its eventual victory could sustain, and it told Margot something about the Calabreses before she'd ever met any of them. They had good intelligence. They knew the Falcone operation from the inside. She figured out who the leak was on a Wednesday afternoon while she was working through a set of financial records Nico had left, carelessly, she thought, though she later revised that opinion, in the library. The patterns were not subtle once you knew to look for them. Someone had been structuring withdrawals to avoid reporting thresholds. Someone had been funneling money through a series of shell accounts to a holding company that, when you followed it back far enough, connected to a law firm that the Calabreses kept on retainer. It took her 4 hours and 2 pots of coffee, and she had the complete picture laid out on her laptop when Nico walked in at 9 that evening looking for a file he'd left there. He stopped when he saw what was on her screen. She turned the laptop to face him. He looked at the screen for a long time. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "How did you find this?" "The withdrawal structuring was the tell," she said. "Once I knew what to look for, the shell sequence was straightforward. It's Sal." Nico was very quiet. "It's been going on for about 14 months, she said. "The Calabrese have been paying him through the law firm. He's gotten approximately $300,000 in that time." "How long did this take you?" She considered. "About 4 hours. I would have had it in 3, but 2 of the shell companies were registered in Delaware and the database was slow." Nico looked at her. Not the way he'd been looking at her for 5 weeks. The careful, neutral look of a man managing a variable he hadn't chosen. He looked at her like he was seeing something for the first time. "You could have taken this to my father," he said. "I'm taking it to you." She closed the laptop. "What you do with it is your business. I just thought you should know." He took the laptop. He stood up to leave. Then he stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "Thank you, Margot." It was the first time he'd used her name. What happened to Saul she was not told and she did not ask. He was simply no longer at the compound after that Thursday. The chair at the end of the dinner table that he had occupied was not taken by anyone else. Nobody mentioned him. The Calabrese family, it turned out, noticed the sudden silence from their source. And silence, in that world, meant one thing. It meant move now, before the window closes. The night they came, it was a Saturday in November. Which was almost funny. She would think about this later. The strange ordinariness of the date. Nico was in the city for a meeting that was supposed to last until midnight. Vincent and Greta had gone to their other house in Connecticut for the weekend. The compound was staffed with a skeleton crew, 2 guards at the gate, 1 in the kitchen, and a rotating perimeter patrol of 2 more. Margot was in the library. She was reading. Specifically, she was reading a biography of a Byzantine empress she'd been meaning to get to for 3 months, and she was at the part where the empress, having been dismissed and exiled and written off by every man in her orbit, returned to Constantinople and made each of them eat their assessments of her one by one. Margot found this enormously satisfying. She heard the first shot at 11:14. It was a single, suppressed crack from somewhere near the east gate. She registered it before she had consciously identified it as a gunshot, something in her uncle's training that had never left, a pattern matching that sat below language. She was already moving when her mind caught up with what her body was doing. She went to the library desk. The 3rd drawer had a false bottom. She'd found it in her 2nd week and noted it, filed the information away. Done nothing with it. Inside the false bottom was a Glock 19 and 2 full magazines, which made sense to her. Someone who used this room had wanted an option. She checked the chamber, confirmed the load, and stood with her back to the wall beside the door. Outside in the hallway, she heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of someone who lived here. Too careful. Too spread out. Multiple people moving in coordinated formation. She waited. The door opened. 2 men came through it, not cautiously enough, which told her they didn't expect resistance in here. She put the first one down before he'd fully registered there was someone standing to his left. The second one spun and she moved into him rather than back, which her uncle had always told her was counterintuitive but correct, and she put him down at a range that made the outcome simple. She stood in the doorway and listened to the compound. There was movement on the 1st floor, at least 2 more. She could hear them in the main hall. The echo carried differently depending on how many bodies were in that space, and she had spent enough evenings sitting in that hall listening to conversations she was not supposed to be part of to know its acoustics. She was on the stairs when her phone buzzed. Nico. She silenced it and kept moving. She found the next one coming out of Vincent's study, where presumably he'd been looking for records or a safe or both. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. She was faster because she had already decided what she was going to do, and he was still processing what he was looking at. A woman in reading glasses and a cardigan, which was apparently not what he had been briefed to expect. His mistake. The last one she found in the kitchen, and this was the only moment that frightened her. Not because of the man himself, but because in the kitchen she found Miguel, the overnight kitchen staffer, zip-tied to a chair and very pale and very alive. She put her finger to her lips. Miguel nodded once, violently. The man who had tied him there was on the phone in the hallway adjacent, not watching the door. She ended that conversation. She cut Miguel's zip ties with the kitchen shears. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, and then he said, "Mrs. Falcone." "Margot," she said. "Margot," he said. "Are they?" "The ones I found," she said. "Stay here, don't use the lights." She cleared the rest of the first floor and then stood in the front hall in the wreckage of a coordinated professional hit, and what she felt was not fear and not exhilaration, but something quieter and more functional than either. A kind of flat, clear assessment of what had just been necessary and what came next. What came next was that Nico's car came through the gate at 11:51. She was sitting on the front steps when he got there, the Glock on the step beside her, her cardigan pulled around her shoulders against the November cold. She had her phone in her hand and she had already called the number Nico had given her for situations requiring immediate cleanup because that was the practical thing to do, and she had done the practical things in order while she waited. Nico got out of the car and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the compound. He looked at her again. "There were 4 of them," she said. "Calabres. Miguel is in the kitchen. He's fine. The guards at the east gate weren't." She paused. "I'm sorry about that." Nico walked up the steps and crouched in front of her, which put them at eye level. He looked at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled neutrality, not the careful distance. Something stripped of all of that. "Margot," he said. "I was reading," she said. "They interrupted me." There was a long pause. "Okay," he said, which were not the words she expected, but his voice when he said them made her look up at him properly, and the thing she saw in his face was something she wasn't entirely prepared for. He sat down on the step beside her. Not inside. Not into the compound to assess and direct and manage. He sat down next to her on the stone step in the November cold, and for a while neither of them said anything. "My father is going to have about 40 questions," Nico said. "I'll answer all of them," she said. "Sal's gone. The leak is blood. The Calabreses panicked and moved early, and they moved with 4 people." He was talking it through, not to her specifically, just talking it through, which means they're not as strong as we thought. They threw their shot and it missed. "It didn't miss," she said. "It just landed differently than they intended." Nico turned and looked at her. The cleanup crew arrived 20 minutes later, and then Vincent and Greta arrived 40 minutes after that. Vincent grim-faced and moving fast, Greta 2 steps behind him with a look on her face that Margot recognized as the look of a woman who had been through nights like this before and had constructed something interior and permanent around them. Vincent wanted a full account. Margot gave it to him, precisely and without embellishment, standing in the front hall where some of the mess was still in evidence. Vincent listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them tactical, and she answered them. When she was done, he looked at her for a moment in silence. "You found the leak," he said. "Yes." "And then this." "Yes." Vincent Falcone was not a man who gave compliments in any recognizable form. What he gave her was a single nod, slow and deliberate, that Greta later told her was the closest he got. Then he turned and started giving orders to the crew. Greta squeezed her arm on the way past. That was all. It was enough. Connie did not make any comments about Margot's size after that. She didn't make many comments about anything when Margot was in the room. The quality of silence she brought to Margot's presence had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of dismissal, but the silence of someone doing a rapid and ongoing reassessment. The Calabrese problem resolved itself over the following 3 weeks, which was faster than anyone had expected, and which Margot had materially contributed to by tracing the rest of their financial infrastructure and producing a document that Nico took to the commission with the kind of evidence that ended arguments. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The Falcons came out of it with territory, 2 agreements, and an apology. Nico came home that evening and found her in the library, back in the same chair, different book. He sat across from her. "The commission called you a strategist," he said. "My father almost fell off his chair." She turned to Paige. "I can imagine." He also said, and I am quoting directly, that I should probably not do anything to mess this up. She looked up from the book. Nico Falcone, who she had watched operate with precision and economy and the complete absence of anything unnecessary for 2 months, had an expression on his face that was entirely human and slightly uncertain and more genuine than anything she had seen from him. "He's not wrong," he said. "He is frequently not wrong," Margot said. "That's been my observation." "Margot?" "Nico." "I know what this arrangement was," he said. "I know what you signed up for. The 2 years, the exit clause." She waited. "I'm not asking you to change that. I'm not." He stopped. He started again. "I'm saying that I was wrong about what I thought this was. In the first week, I had an idea of what this arrangement looked like, and I had decided in advance what you were and weren't, and I was wrong." The library was very quiet. "There's a difference," she said carefully, "between a man who is wrong and admits it, and a man who is wrong and doesn't." "I know which I'm trying to be," he said. "I know," she said. Outside, the November wind had picked up, and the old compound creaked slightly the way it always did, like a house settling into itself after a long day. Margot set her book on the table, spine up to hold her page, and she looked at the man across from her, who was precise and difficult and had been wrong about her and was sitting here saying so, and she felt the careful architecture she had built around herself over the last 2 months shift slightly. Not collapse, not dissolve. Shift, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side is finally trying the handle gently rather than walking past. "The exit clause is still there," she said. "I'm not saying anything about the exit clause right now." "Okay," he said. "I'm saying that I don't currently find this situation intolerable." "That's generous," he said dryly. "I'm a generous person," she said. "People who've been paying attention know that." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, the closest he'd come, in her experience, to an unguarded smile. "The Byzantine Empress," he said, nodding at the book. "Have you read it?" "Twice," he said. "She's terrifying." "She's remarkable," Margot said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "There is." The 2 years ran out eventually, the way all deadlines do. When the date came, the exit clause sat in a folder in Margot's desk, signed and notarized and ready, the way she kept all important documents, precisely organized, immediately accessible, prepared for every contingency. She didn't use it. Not because she had forgotten it was there, not because she was swept away by anything so imprecise as that, but because she was a forensic accountant and she understood better than most people that the only calculation that mattered was the one in front of you, with the actual numbers, not the ones you'd assumed at the beginning before the data came in. The data had come in. She'd looked at it. She'd made her assessment. The folder stayed in the desk. Outside the library window, the Westchester winter was finally softening into something that looked like spring, and Margot Hess, who had been called a placeholder, a liability, dead weight, a practical solution to an inconvenient problem, sat in the best chair in the house, in the room that had become entirely hers, and turned the page. I keep thinking about Margot sitting on those front steps, November cold, cardigan pulled around her shoulders, the Glock resting on the stone beside her like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Not shaking, not crying, just waiting, practically for the next thing that needed to be done. That image stays with me because I think we've been sold a lie about what strength looks like. We expect it to be loud. We expect it to announce itself, to demand recognition, to perform, and when it doesn't, when it shows up in a cardigan, in reading glasses, in a woman everyone in that room had already decided didn't matter, we don't see it. We look right past it. That's not an accident. That's what happens when you let other people's assumptions do your seeing for you. What Margot understood, in a way that most people never get to, is that being underestimated is not a wound. It's a position. It gives you room to move that the people who are watched and feared and constantly managed simply don't have. Every person in that compound had built a story about her before she'd unpacked a single suitcase, and she let them keep it. Not because she was passive, not because she was resigned, but because she was resigned. but because she was smarter than that. She knew the story wasn't hers to correct. The evidence would do that on its own when the time came. And that took something that I think gets talked about less than it should. A kind of quiet, unshakable integrity with yourself. Not with the room. Not with what the room wanted from her or expected of her or thought she owed them. With herself. Margot never pretended to be less than she was. She just didn't go out of her way to prove what she was either. She did the work. She filed the information away. She waited. That's not passivity. That's a kind of moral clarity that most of us spend years trying to find and never quite get to. Then there was the intelligence, not just the forensic accounting, not just the ability to read a shell company's paper trail at 9 o'clock at night in a room she wasn't supposed to be in. The real intelligence was knowing what to do with what she knew. She could have taken that file to Vincent. She could have used it to position herself. She took it to Nico quietly, and she left the rest to him. That restraint, that judgment about when to act and how, that's not something you learn in school. That's something you build, slowly, through paying attention to how the world actually works, instead of how you wish it did. And then the hardest thing, which I think is the thing most people skip over, she kept going. Through the dismissals, through Connie's comments at the dinner table, through hearing herself described as soft and useless, through a closed door. She didn't collapse, and she didn't perform outrage. She went back to her book. She went back to her work. She held the shape of who she was, under pressure that would have reshaped most people, and she did it without anyone watching, without anyone giving her credit for it, because that was just the cost of being in that house, and she had done her math and decided it was worth paying. What got Sal caught was that he underestimated how carefully she was looking. What got the Calabreses stopped was that they underestimated what she was capable of when no one was watching. The outcome wasn't luck. It was the natural result of a year of being precisely, consistently, stubbornly herself in a place that had decided she was nothing. That's the thing about consequences. They don't care about the stories people tell. They only care about what you actually did, when it counted, when nobody was looking. Margot knew that. She'd known it for a long time. I think that's why, when the 2 years were up and the exit clause was sitting in her desk, she put it away without using it. Not because she'd been won over by romance or swept into something she hadn't chosen, but because she'd done her accounting the way she always did, with the actual numbers in front of her, and the numbers were good,